Why did you tell the committee, this committee, that you helped facilitate an £800,000 loan for the man who then gave you this plum appointment that you now hold?
I didn't facilitate a loan.
You introduced the person who gave the loan to him. The person who gave the loan told you that he was going to help the Prime Minister with what you call his difficulties. You facilitated it because you made an introduction knowing that it was about money.
I introduced Mr. Blyth to Mr. Case. I did not introduce Mr. Blyth to Mr. Johnson.
But nonetheless, you knew what the score was, and you didn't tell us about it. Let me remind you of what you signed up to on your BBC application. It says the following: you cannot be considered if you fail to declare any conflict of interest. Clearly this was a conflict of interest. It continues, any issues on your personal or professional history that could, if you were appointed, cause embarrassment or public confidence to be jeopardised must be disclosed. This clearly causes the BBC embarrassment. Why didn't you disclose it?
Just to be clear, I didn't arrange the loan. I did at the meeting.
You helped with the loan. The loan would not have happened, presumably, if you hadn't played the role that you did.
As I said, I was ensuring due process was followed. I can't speculate on what would have happened or not happened had I not had the meeting with Mr. Case.
But tell us why you didn't disclose it.
The meeting I had with Mr. Case explicitly addressed the issue of my candidature for the BBC. And in talking to Mr. Case, I'm talking to the most senior subservient in the land, and within that area is proprietary and ethics, as you know.
Yeah, but you did disclose it to this committee. You clearly should have done. Let's continue and have a little look at the timetable as the chair. There'll be plenty of time, and let's try and kind of go through it relatively snappily. Now, the application's closed for your job in November the 11th, I understand.
Mm-hmm.
Did you have a meeting with Boris Johnson before you submitted your application, about your application, a meeting when he said, let's make the BBC great?
No.
You didn't have a meeting. You didn't discuss. You didn't discuss your job application before you submitted it with the Prime Minister.
I'd like to answer the question, if I may.
Please do.
I did go to Mr. Johnson to tell him that I wished to apply to be the chair of the BBC. That was not the meeting where he told me, let's make the BBC great. He asked me why I wanted to do it, and I told him at that time why I wanted to do it. And because I care about the BBC, and I thought I could make a significant contribution. I'd made a contribution to the Treasury.
Yes.
I'd supported the industries.
I can understand why you wanted the job, Mr. Sharp, but I'm just trying to get through some of the details. So.
Yes.
You had a meeting with the Prime Minister before you submitted the application. Now, it's important to remember who the board was for this. It included a Tory party donor plus the wife of Boris Johnson's former Spectator chair, so not exactly a hostile board. And you were such a shoo-in for this that, according to Robert Peston, ministers told other applicants not to waste time submitting their applications. So let's look at Boris Johnson's loan. As we've heard, his cousin approached you at a dinner party and said he wanted to give Boris Johnson a lot of money because, again, to use your phrase, he was in some difficulties.
He did not say that.
He didn't say he wanted to give him money?
No, he didn't. He said he wanted to help him.
Well, what does that mean?
Of course, it implies that it could be money or anything else. He didn't say a lot of money.
Right, so let's not dance on the head of a pin. He wanted to help him out of his difficulties because the Prime Minister couldn't manage on his £164,000 salary. I'm still not quite clear why he didn't, since he was a cousin, just ask Boris Johnson directly, do you want some cash, cuz?
Well, again, I'd say that it's probably worth recalling what was going on at the time. We had no vaccine. We faced a national crisis. We had an economy that was collapsing, potentially. We had no vaccine. And he was concerned that his cousin should focus on the job.
Quite. So the cousin would have taken the phone call clearly, if he phoned up and said, I want to help you out financially. Now, originally, we've discussed this.
May I come back to answer?
Yes, please, perhaps in the next answer. You told journalists that the dinner was in November 2020. Now, you've said that the journalists have said they got that wrong. The Sunday Times journalists actually said that they think you got that wrong in the initial briefing that your representative gave them. But that's, we can leave that to one side, because, of course, it would have been illegal to have had a dinner in November because COVID lockdown was on. So you now say that the conversation with Mr. Blyth was in September. Mm-hmm. In other words, before you applied for the BBC chairmanship post. Yeah. So Boris Johnson knew you were helping him effectively with the £800,000 loan when you applied for it.
No, he didn't. He did. First of all, I did not help with any loan. Just to be clear,
facilitated.
I think the detail, as you said, matters.
So made the introduction. So Boris Johnson knew that you'd made an introduction between him and his cousin, who apparently needed introduced to him, even though he was his cousin, and you'd made that introduction. £800,000 was the figure, huge amount of money, and Boris Johnson knew that this was happening, was in the pipeline before you applied for the BBC chair post.
With respect, Mr. Nicholson, there are a lot of things you just said are incorrect, and if you may, I'd like to answer them in detail.
Please continue.
Thank you. So when the dinner that I had with Mr. Blyth was in September, and at that time there was no figure mentioned at all. There was no mention of it being a loan. It was clearly financial, but there was no specific figure, and I actually don't believe that there has been any knowledge of what financing has been provided, and all I have seen is Mr. Blyth commenting publicly, saying that the amount speculated is wrong. So,
but that doesn't mean much. It could be 750 or it could be 950. We knew the scale of the Prime Minister's difficulties were sufficient that his multi-millionaire cousin needed to step in and help him. So let's not dwell on the exact amount. There was a lot of money.
May I address some of the other issues you raised that I think
yes.
are correct? Okay. So, as I said, when I when I went to meet the Prime Minister and told him that I wanted to apply to be the chair of the BBC, at that point I hadn't heard from Mr. Blyth asking me to put him in touch with Mr. Case. So as far as I was concerned at that time, that was something that had happened in a dinner party conversation in September. And when I had the conversation with the Prime Minister about wanting to apply to be the chair of the BBC, that I had no knowledge at that point that Mr. Blyth was doing anything to take it anything further forward.
So you didn't say to the Prime Minister, your cousin's looking to help you out?
No, I did not.
Okay, so although you discussed the loan with Mr. Blyth, Boris Johnson's cousin, in September 2020, you didn't actually go to see the Cabinet Secretary until December, so quite a long time afterwards. At that discussion with the Cabinet Secretary, did anyone else attend? Were any minutes taken?
Well, this comes back to answering one of your earlier questions, which is at that meeting I raised with the Cabinet Secretary that I was in the application process for the BBC chairmanship. And therefore, at that time, we discussed precisely that to avoid a conflict or the appearance of conflict, I should have nothing further to do with it. At that meeting, there were two people. I was there and Mr. Case was there.
Nobody was taking notes. Now, you told the media show...
Mr. Case was, I believe, taking notes.
Yeah, but you'd have expected a civil servant to be right there rather than the Cabinet Secretary taking his own notes. Now, you told the media show that you told Boris Johnson you were going to see the Cabinet Secretary about the loan. So when Boris Johnson says that you knew nothing about his financial affairs, and to quote him, he was ding-dang sure about that, that's obviously untrue.
Well, what he knows is that the only information I have about his financial affairs are the same that you have.
So you knew that he was in dire straits financially, despite his huge salary. So, and you'd been involved in a discussion with his cousin about that. Did you tell anyone apart from the cabinet secretary about this conversation with his cousin?
No, I didn't.
Okay, so you didn't tell your interview panel at the BBC. You didn't tell the DCMS permanent secretary, because she's told the Public Accounts Committee that she'd been left completely in the dark. And as we've established, you didn't tell us, but we know that the Cabinet Secretary was uncomfortable because he sent a letter telling Boris Johnson to stop seeking financial advice from you, and you've already covered that, so I think we can leave that. But the nail-biting application process was over, you had the job, and you went off to celebrate at Chequers. Now, I understand that it was Sam Blyth who invited you to Chequers. And he said, and I quote, "Do you want to come to Chequers? I'm going to have dinner with Al," in other words, Boris Johnson. So you were effectively his plus one, is that correct?
Can I come back to something you said earlier, which is about the fact that having had a conversation with Mr. Case, where I'd specifically raised the issue and proactively raised the issue of my BBC application, that he had agreed that to avoid a conflict or perception of conflict, that the issue was resolved by my not being in any way further involved in any process or any discussion about what would then transpire. And that is why, at that point, as far as I was concerned, the matter had been resolved with respect for the need for disclosure. Yeah,
but the Cabinet Secretary was alarmed about this. But I want to pursue the Chequers dinner for a second, because it strikes me that his cousin, Sam Blyth, and Boris Johnson had become very pally at this stage, which is surprising, because only a short time previously you'd had to introduce them effectively, although they were cousins, or you'd had to act as a go-between to the extent that you've described.
Okay. May I address those points? Mr. Blyth first met Mr. Johnson when Mr. Johnson was a little boy. I did not introduce him to Mr. Johnson. I did not introduce.
You reintroduced.
I did not introduce Mr. Blyth to the Johnson family in any way that he was known to them. You correctly characterised me as a go-between. As a go-between, I was not between Mr. Blyth and Mr. Johnson, but I was actually seeking to ensure that due process was followed by ensuring that Mr. Blyth had contact with the Cabinet Office before he would do anything to help his cousin.
At the Chequers dinner, did you talk about the loan?
No. I didn't talk about anything about the financing or anything that transpired as a result of any contact that Mr. Blyth would have had with the Cabinet Office.
I've heard you say that you talked about the licence fee at that dinner. You talked about the licence fee, you lobbied about the licence fee in front of Mr. Blyth,
yes,
the cousin, which seems strange. Were civil servants present?
No, it was a dinner.
So nobody was taking notes at this Chequers dinner?
Correct.
When all this blew up, of course, the Commissioner for Public Appointments, William Shawcross, was due to investigate, and you welcomed that. But after a week, he recused himself because he said he'd met you. Well, you clearly met a lot of people, and I'm guessing it must be more than that. What's your relationship with Mr. Shawcross?
Well, I think I've met him in the last 15 years maybe 2 or 3 times. I think the last time I was at a dinner with him maybe over a decade ago. But he's so... I know of him. I know some of his relatives by marriage.
Have you ever been in business with him?
No.
Have you ever discussed business with him?
No.
His daughter is a senior number 10 aide, and his son-in-law, Simon Wolfson, like you, is a Tory donor. So do you think that's the reason that he's recused himself? Have you spoken to him about why he recused himself?
No, I haven't.
Okay. Will you resign if the inquiry criticises you for withholding information?
Well, I'll need to see what the inquiry produces.
Well, if the inquiry says you should have told the members of the interview panel about the loan that you helped facilitate, the introductions that you made, if they said that you should have told this committee, that'll be pretty clear. Will you resign?
Well, just to be clear, I was subject to a very rigorous interview process. I needed to be considered appointable, if you like, and recommendable. As you know from Lord Dacre's experience, any preferences don't necessarily guarantee that independent committees form that view. And I'm confident that in that sense, that not only was I appointed my merits, but I also am confident that my subsequent performance at the BBC...
Although you previously applied for a job in the BBC board, am I right?
I applied to be a non-executive, they had a different structure at that time.
Yes.
And I applied to be a non-executive on the management board, not the governance board.
And you didn't get the job?
I didn't actually get an interview at that time.
What do you think the difference was between your failed application then and your application now following the huge facility that you helped the Prime Minister with?
I did not help the Prime Minister with a huge facility.
Have you any idea how angry BBC staff are with you?
Look, I regret the distraction this has caused. There's no doubt about that. And certainly I'm, disturbed by the fact that all the tremendous things that the BBC is doing should anyway be overshadowed by this. I'm sure, like most of the rest of you, well,
they're absolutely furious, and I've had a huge mailbag from BBC staff about it. And a recurring question, one of many things they're angry with you about, is the fact that you're not a journalist, but inexplicably chose to sit on the selection panel for the head of news position.
Would you like me to address that issue? Is there a question there?
Yes. Do you understand why they're angry about that?
Well, if they're angry about that, then they don't actually understand, and we need to do a better job of explaining the governance of the BBC as it currently is. May I go on?
Yes.
Okay, so we have a unitary board, and I'm the non-executive chairman. Now, the detail matters. So, for example, if you look at Netflix, they have an executive chairman. And the non-executive often gets overlooked in terms of the meaning in corporate governance. But really what it is to draw a bright line between the executive and how they execute and the board in terms of owning the strategy and the issues the board deals with. And in a unitary board, and this detail is very important in terms of governance, the board has certain critical functions to do. And if you look at those functions, they critically own the strategy, they own the creative remit for the BBC, they own the budget, and they ensure value for money. They have to have, and this goes to our purposes, a framework for assessing the BBC's UK public services, including the World Service. They have to have a policy on the distribution of the public services.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm going to interrupt. I'm going to have to interrupt, because otherwise you'll read out a big long list.
Okay,
you were on the board.
May I come back?
No, I want to pursue that point. You were on the board for the Director of News. That is a journalistic appointment. It is not appropriate, I don't think, and BBC staff don't think, for you to be on the board for a journalistic appointment, albeit that it has board implications. It was fundamentally a journalistic appointment. And I think if I could summarise really in closing, I'll let you come back after this. What appalls, I think, so many BBC staff is that you got this job with no BBC experience. They knew about the vast donations to the Tory party that you'd given, but they didn't know about the £800,000, something that you withheld from the interview panel, the DCMS Permanent Secretary and this committee. And I think it leaves the impression so much of this is deeply establishment. It's pals appointing pals, donating money to pals, and I think, as I said in the chamber, it rather leaves the impression that it's all a bit banana republic and cosy.
May I come back to the question of the appointment of the head of news, which I think is quite critical. And the reason I was outlining the board responsibilities is because the board is composed of a majority of non-executives and also executive directors on the board. And the executive directors, there are 4 of them, including the head of news, have a function to deliver as members of the board and directors to perform that function. And it is absolutely in the charter that the nominations committee of the board gets involved in the appointment of board positions. So when I met Deborah Turnus, it was following. First of all, she reports as the Director of News directly to the Chief Executive, who is the Director General. There was a management board that went through the process of determining candidates. So the meeting that I attended in terms of the selection of Deborah Turnus as a member of the BBC was quite properly for her to be a member of that board to fulfill those functions on the board. And it is in a requirement of the nominations committee, it is in the charter of the nominations committee, that they should interview and be part of a process of appointments to the board, and that includes the executive directors. So my involvement in the appointment of Deborah Turnus was precisely what I should do as the chair of the board with other members of the nominations committee who sat on that session to determine her capabilities to contribute to the board as a director of the board with that list of functions that I outlined, which are critically important. With respect to her position as Director of News, she reports to the Director General.
Back to you, Chair.
Okay. Thank you. Kevin Brennan.